And I don't know, I haven't heard from Jessica. I don't know if she was planning to. So I put the agenda in the chat, but it's kind of, the formatting's weird. So actually, if you look, it's Darren's going to share some relevant takeaways from his study group through NASB, which sounds really exciting. We've been talking about it over the last few weeks, and I'm just so excited that Darren, the timing is amazing, and that actually Darren has this background anyway and is just going to add so much to this work. So thank you for that. And then I will share some takeaways from, I was able to meet with teachers yesterday at WISIT, and it was like, I was telling Darren, I was expecting, maybe a group of 5. It ended up being like 25, which was a little too much, actually. I mean, I wish it had been smaller, but it was really interesting. So I'll share a little bit about that and the WISIT conference in general. And then I'm hoping that we can talk about the proposed plan that I sent out, and really start moving ahead with this work, so that when we come back and school starts, we actually have something in motion. And I did have on here to revisit ideas, and what I'm going to propose now is just knowing how the time goes, that we do that offline. If there's something, those are in the notes or the plan that I sent at the bottom. And I tried to capture like the things that each of you said that I didn't include in the plan. So if there's something that still feels important to you, I will leave it to you to bring it back to the group, if that sounds right. So does this sound good? Is there anything anyone wanted to add or ask about before we get started? Okay, cool. So Darren, do you want to get started?
Sure. Kind of organized my thoughts on this. So
it
sounds like I'm reading off of something. I am.
All right.
So NASB's Whole Child Study Group is made up of 22 state board members across the U.S. engaged in some work around equity and whole child policymaking. The purpose of the group is to deepen our content expertise and ultimately have state board members take the lead on whole child policymaking in the wake of COVID-19. The pandemic has shone a bright light on the longstanding inequities in the education system and presents opportunities to improve the school system, policies, and practices that contribute to student success. This includes recognizing school climate and the ways to evaluate it in the school environment. The Learning Policy Institute is supporting the project with their own research and policy expertise. The first meeting was held on July 17th and will continue every other month up until April 16th. The next meeting will be on September 11th. Prior to meetings, we are given required readings and written assignments, as well as an agenda for what the upcoming meeting will cover. The July meeting was more of an introductory meeting on the purpose of the group, its expectations, and what each member is doing in their state around whole child policymaking. When we broke into small groups on that July meeting, I had the chance to talk with other state board members about their work and get a better sense of their needs and challenges. For example, Jenna Ainer of Delaware's State Board mentioned that they have a mission statement but are struggling on how to operationalize it. Her state board recently published a database capturing nonprofit organizations involved with whole child policies. At the same time, at the time of our meeting, they were still discussing how to use this. Whole child policymaking is part of NASB's Rapid Response Initiative to states' needs and areas of rebuilding schools and school systems. So just to give you a definition of whole child, a whole child approach to education is defined by policies, practices, and relationships that ensure that each child in each school in each community is healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. Well-rounded education is more or less a combination of core academic subjects. This is still part of the whole child approach to education. And as this committee has defined well-rounded education, you all put down students access to balanced course offerings and experiences across disciplines, including ample time for humanities, science, art, physical education, as well as math and literacy. So now I'm going to go a little bit more into some of the members of this study group. What is great about this study group is that all of us will begin making connections with each other and sharing ideas outside of the meetings. I've reached out to other members about operationalizing their equity frameworks and whole child work and plan to meet with them in the coming weeks before our next NASB meeting. 3 of the 22 members are from Kentucky and are heavily engaged in equity and whole child work. For example, they recently passed an equity and unintended biases resolution and are in the process to set their broad vision with their new commissioner. Jeffrey Van Holten of Utah with his state board has a vision and mission statement. While it is whole child in content, the word whole child is not used. As he put it, we've never done a whole child needs assessment or how the agency moves the work forward. His board is not sure how to carry out whole child policy, and the board has centered itself around equity. They're working hard to get that in, and their next step is to get a needs assessment developed to understand what needs to be done to close learning gaps. And lastly, Pamela Davis Vaught of Virginia, her state board uses whole child language in their policy creating blueprint. Communicating amongst members and NASB personnel is more or less, members are encouraged to connect with each other as well as participate in 1 hour bi-monthly or bi-weekly calls with NASB personnel on any questions or thoughts we might have. So yesterday, I spent about 2 hours with Megan Blanco, who is heading up the NASB study group. First, we discussed opportunities for our fellow Sandra to publish her work on school climate and distance learning as an op-ed, and steps needed to be taken for her work, as well as DC state board members to publish their own op-eds through NASB. And different formats look like state innovations, power of the question, standard articles, commentary, or policy updates with DC. Following this meeting, I can share a few of the resources they provided to me. If that's something you all are interested in, I recommend we use this opportunity since NASB uses its platform to publicly highlight what states are doing. Megan and I also talked at length about best practices around stakeholder outreach and what has worked for other state boards when it comes to project planning and management. Last night, she shared with me a comprehensive template for project management designed around state board initiatives. Previous to our call yesterday, she has also been very responsive around other questions I had, including what other states are doing around assessments going into fall, how assessments can be used to address learning gaps, and best practices around stakeholder outreach, all of which I'd be happy to share following this meeting. We have not received an agenda or reading assignments for the next meeting, but we do have access to an entire library of articles available on NASB's Google folder that range from bullying, chronic absence, and community schools to SEL, suicide prevention, and trauma-informed schools. After the first weeks of being part of this group, and having access to NASB's resource and assistance from NASB staff, I feel like the sky is the limit for what the Well-Rounded Education Committee can do with our projects going forward, any future projects, stakeholder outreach, or just general understanding of education concepts you'd be interested in pursuing and learning about. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Darren. That's really interesting. It sounds like at least 2 states you mentioned, if not more, are focusing on equity as their way of sort of addressing whole child needs. That maybe that's a way of sort of encompassing a lot of the needs, right? So I think we can be in that category too, even though we didn't frame it that way. I think we are sort of coming to that in some ways, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Darren, I have a question related to the project planning piece. So when because I like a lot what Emily was just saying about how to really actionize. Is that a word? I don't know. It's a little early. I didn't finish my coffee. But to work with some of the things that Zachary and I have been talking about on the equity framework in this process of the well-rounded education piece, I really like that idea. And I'm wondering, so I'm looking at the email plan that you sent out, Emily, about what we as a committee were thinking about doing and how to do this, and I'm trying to figure out how we can put that into a project plan so that we know where we're heading and what the goal is. And I think by using that equity framework, we might be able to, this might be a really great sort of first crack at what we're doing on it. And I see Ruth has a comment, but I know Zachary had a comment too, so I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to echo that. It sounds really interesting. I would love for you to just represent the work that we're doing around an equity framework to that committee, both for just making sure that DC is represented, that this is top of mind for us as well, but also so that we can learn, or I don't know if it's like a critical friends type format, but that could be beneficial. Also, as you were, I forget which state you were talking about, that they are examining equity needs in their like systems. If you recall in the proposal, that's actually stage 2 of this equity work over the next few years. So the first was like building out the framework and the statement, and then we too are slated to just examine like what are the high critical equity levers, for instance, teacher retention, that we want to examine. And so any information you could bring back either offline or in the next meeting would be really helpful to just see how other state boards are approaching that.
Can certainly do that. I think that was Utah's, one of the state board members from Utah mentioned that.
And is that like what they as a board are taking up, or that one member?
The board.
Got it.
And I know Kentucky was the one that just passed the equity and unintended biases resolution. So I feel like they're almost one step ahead of us with passing it, but they still don't know what to do with it. And so it'd be interesting to like see their thinking around that.
I had actually talked with their executive director months ago about our work on equity and talked about how we framed ours with as a task force. This was before we started the revision process from Zachary. But I had talked with them a couple times about it too. Idaho is actually a super interesting case too, because their state board actually has pre-K through post-secondary authority, which is, I think, fascinating. And so they're really able to see the entire, I don't know, my brain isn't working. I want to make sure that Ruth gets a chance to talk because she had her hand up. So Ruth.
Hi, I just had a question, which is one of the things you said, Darren, was that they were looking at what is work stakeholder outreach, and I don't know if they yet have ideas on that, or that's just something happening.
I could share after this meeting. They provided NASB personnel provided me with an entire document with just resources and their thoughts around DC specific stakeholder outreach. So they looked at what OSSE's plans are going forward, even historically going back to 2018. What has been worked on, what's been proposed, and how the work we're doing currently aligns with past work.
It's not about how other state boards are reaching out for stakeholder input.
And it is about that too. So it's also, I failed to mention, it also adds best practices around reaching out to stakeholders and then sharing out information from whatever we gather, be it surveys, panels, whatever it is. What are the best practices, communicating that back out to constituents?
Okay,
Great.
yeah, if there's interesting stuff in there that we don't already know about, do use. I'm interested in that. And the other thing related to that is, we tend to connect with NASB because those are the state boards, which makes a lot of sense. But we also, there's a part of us, there's a dimension of us that's more like a city board, a district board, because our constituents are so close together, and most of them are in the great plurality is in one LEA. So I think it would also be worth checking with NSBA, the School Boards Association, just and see if they have any ideas about outreach. I mean, we've had so many issues. How do we get our surveys, for the surveys about devices, for example, out to people who don't have pets? And this kind of issue has come up before. How can we reach out more broadly to people who don't typically get involved? And I'm curious if they have any ideas.
Yeah, there's some really interesting history in Kentucky on their surveying, because they have a long history of being able to survey large, percentages of their population for education issues, and have been doing so for quite a while. And we can talk through their data warehouse folks as well.
So that's something that Darren can work on and has already started collecting information on. So thank you for that, Darren. And I think what makes sense is, as we move forward and we're ready to take that step, it's on that as a committee. Like, we should actually read the things that Darren shares with us.
And it'll be interesting
Not
to share out
Yeah.
like where we are, be it with my phone calls with other state board members, or in the next meeting say, okay, this is where we're at, and then just get their thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Or help other state board members out if we feel like we're strong in an area, like maybe highlight those.
Help other boards, is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Raise our visibility, not just in DC, but nationwide.
And Ruth, I think I missed, you're saying as a smaller operating as like a district. Did you mention a different organization? I think I missed.
Yeah, NSBA, National School Boards Association, which it's like NASD for the district school boards.
We are
we're not a member, so I don't know what we can get, but they may talk to you.
We are in limbo. We are neither here nor there, or we are both there and here.
We're Schrodinger's state board.
Yeah, NSBA has better parties than NASB does.
Oh, well, there you go. Even online, Marcus?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Thank you for that input. John Paul, I have a question. So you were mentioning, or you had suggested doing something concrete, I think, with the equity piece of this in our work, and I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm looking over the plan that's in your email from July 31st. I'm assuming that's still the valid one, so that's the way I'm looking at. But yeah, I mean, I think the equity framework really does give us some suggestions on how to look at all of our work, really. And so, since this is, I mean, to me, well-rounded education is clearly an equity issue, and it's easy to kind of make those connections in my mind. Trying to figure out sort of that project plan of, what is our ultimate goal? Is our goal to get information out? Is our goal to, have a set of recommendations for LEAs to consider, or OSSE to consider? Is our what is the goal? And then working back from that, how do we make sure that the right communities are involved in the conversation? And how do we make it more than just talking to ourselves?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good segue, actually. And we did talk about that. Zach and Darren and I had a conversation last week, I think, about exactly that. And I think we also did talk about this at our last committee meeting, which is that we don't want to just, I think up until now, we have really been focused on having panels that would inform us as a body. And that we want to move beyond that. And actually, that's fine if that's part of it. But that really what we want to end up with is something that is practical and, something that stakeholders can and want to use, right? So I think our goal is, yes, becoming more informed and then using that to create something. So I kind of want to jump right to that, but I will just say that, the conversation I had with teachers yesterday who were at the WISIT conference. So these are teachers from all sectors, including private and religious schools. So, but it's something like 70% public and charter. And they are from DMV. And that was represented, I think it went from pre-K to middle school, my group. And I asked them, a pretty broad question about how did they feel in the spring. They, like what were some best practices from the spring around well-rounded education? Whole child education. So, and I defined it as actually those 4 points here, I'll put that in the chat actually. One of the articles that Darren shared, sorry. But basically, looking at family connection, meeting the needs of the students around taking ownership of their own learning. I can't remember the 4, but anyway, I did outline it. And what they focused on was really sort of survival. Like that's what I noticed. And that made sense for the spring. And it made me think about, I also tuned into a Transcend webinar a few weeks ago. And I really liked sort of how they framed what they're doing, which is this. I'm going to put this in the chat too. It was responding, recovering, and reinventing sort of as steps, and that we are in the responding, or in the spring, we are definitely in sort of the responding, that maybe now we're in the recovering and will be for a little while, in the fall, but that what we're moving towards is reinventing what our schools look like, what education looks like. And so my big takeaway from the discussion I had with the teachers is that they were in the responding and recovering mode during the spring, but that they are thinking about how to reinvent in the fall. And that I think we can kind of think about that to guide us as well, that like, there's still going to be a lot of recovery in the fall, but if we do invite speakers, that we should be thinking in this way of like, we are moving towards something that is beyond just survival mode, right? This is what's needed now, but that we're moving towards something. I do just share some specific takeaways from that discussion, some surprises that came out of that. So one of the things that wasn't surprising was just a lot of them talked about centering families, that ended up being the most important thing. And what I realized when I was talking to them is that families are literally teaching partners now, right? Like they are literally co-teachers in a lot of ways. And the home is part of the classroom. And it sounds obvious, but when they were talking about having these really frequent meetings with their families, that just became really apparent why that was so important. The other thing that they talked about was that, obviously the tech issue, that not all their families had tech. And when they got it, they felt like they were suddenly on the spot to be troubleshooters, and they weren't always equipped to be able to do that. And what, I would say a quarter of them chimed in and talked about was that being able to just make phone calls actually was really important, that they checked in with their families sometimes twice a week on the phone, and that it was really important that families actually had paper packets and books, so that they could actually just do like check-ins on the phone, and talk about the work that the students had. And they recommend that we continue to do that in the fall, as well as, you know, having all the tech stuff up and running and, you know, figure out the tech support piece. So that might be a place to start, is just that really basic delivery piece. And we can talk about that more, but I'm just putting that out there, that that was really sort of where we were in the spring, you know, was connecting with families, making sort of these connections that helped families stop panicking, where they felt like they had a connection to school. And, you know, one of the other surprising things was that, you know, some said they actually felt like they got to know their students and their families in a much deeper way through distance learning, because they were, again, partnering with them in a way that wasn't the case when they were just in a classroom and the teacher was clearly in this, you know, lead role. So, so those were the main takeaways from that. Any thoughts or questions from that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the statutory responsibilities of the state board is that we have approval authority over state policies for parental engagement. And what sounds to me like, or parental involvement. So what it sounds to me is like that could be our goal, right? Through this process, what we're trying to do is find the best practices for a state entity's recommendations on parental involvement. And this is how you might do that. And it's not, I think that's too narrow for what we're talking about here, but I think that engagement piece is really, really important for the equity piece. Yeah. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to sort of marry those two things together that I recognize are different, but like having
the equity and the parent engagement?
Yeah, like the equity on parent engagement, but also like bringing it back to this whole child thing. Like there are certainly schools that are doing a great job with parental engagement, and there are schools that aren't quite there yet, right? And I think some of the schools that are doing a great job really have leadership that is focused on that as a goal, as a something that is necessary for them to do. And I think we have the opportunity through our statute to have that as one of the pieces that we can start considering of what does it mean to be involved as a parent at a school. Like it doesn't necessarily mean coming to a PTA meeting every day or every month or whatever. Right? That's not the same thing. And
yeah,
you know,
I mean, I think it's the place to start. That's, I guess, what I'm saying is, you know, if we have, I mean, I will move now if there's somebody else. I'm sorry, you, John Paul.
Well, I was gonna say, even on top of John Paul, what it means for a parent to engage, right? What it means for a school to engage parents in a standard way, in a more equitable way, is important too. And I also don't want to stray far away from that because I think that's an important conversation. But also, Emily, when you think about when we get into the conversation around reinventing, and I don't clearly want the board to circle back on conversations we've had probably 2 or 3 times, but like the thoughts of like competency based and mastery based, right, learning, and like how we measure mastery, and I think is also like a part of that reinventing, right? Because right, how we assess a student's progress in the classroom or in a virtual space, right, just has to be different. But it also gives us the opportunity, right, the recommendations we made before I joined the board, but also the same recommendations we made in the high school GradRex task force, is like, how do we give students credit for what they're learning outside the traditional classroom space? I think is also a really relevant conversation now too.
And I do think, so that's great, you both of you, because I think that's the evolution I'm envisioning, is starting with what John Paul was talking about, where we are focusing on family engagement, which seems at this moment, it's always important, but at this moment, it's like a deal breaker kind of if you're not doing it. You know, like students can't learn if parents don't feel supported to support them in this new reality, right? Like that is ground zero. And I think what you're talking about, Marcus, is sort of when we are at a point with schools kind of, we know what they're going to look like. We can have those kinds of conversations about, I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't have them now. I'm just saying I envision talking about like getting to the well-rounded education and assessment is sort of advanced, right? Like that's the reinventing piece. And I think that's what you're saying. So if you can imagine those at two ends of an arc, and that we create something, and I think we had talked about panels, right? But now what I would like to put forward is the idea of maybe having a panel or two, and or just making, like having webinars that are open to the public, that are, I think, Zach, you were saying maybe these could be based on what we find out from our surveys, geared towards specific stakeholders. So one might be really geared towards parents who are struggling with the tech piece. I mean, I think that would be for parents and the educators, but whatever, that's really focused on tech and how you support that for everyone. And that would be a webinar that's open to the public, and that at the end of it, you have a recording that you can have as a resource. You have resources that have been shared. And you also, at the end of that, invite the public to share what they need next, so that we're collecting information directly from our stakeholders about what their needs are and what they think our next steps should be on that. So it's a much more sort of, I think Zach used dialogic a little bit, that term. More dialogic, more, kind of back and forth with our constituents instead of just a panel that's informing us. So that's something I would like to propose. And it's based on my experience with the Transcend webinar. And so I think if we could provide that, and I will just add one more thing, which is that I think there are a lot of webinars now, but what would make ours sort of an SBOE webinar is that it really is about inviting, our constituents, our stakeholders, our schools, like having our educators and our school leaders speaking. The Transcend webinar I attended was the principal from Van Ness speaking, and she was fabulous, like very inspiring, very sharing information that is, I think, essential about how to set up SEL practices from the start with distance learning. So that's my thing about it. And if we started with, as you said, John Paul, like started with the family engagement piece, because that's what makes sense right now. But then as we get information from our surveys and from what Darren gathered from the surveys that have already been done, we can sort of think about a logical continuum. So that's my thought. What do you think?
This is Ruth. I just want to ask one question relevant to that, Emily, which is maybe a month ago, John Paul posed an idea to Marcus and to me about creating some sort of set of sort of videos, posts, whatever, that were about highlighting how families were functioning in this world. And I just wanted to see what's going on with that, how that fits in. Are you doing that?
Yeah, so to give some more context, so this was an idea that came to us from the Ombudsman's office about having sort of a portal for parents to share sort of good ideas about what they're doing during home education. So for instance, like if, I have a background in history, if I was talking about with, if I had any children, if I was talking with my kids about, something in historical sense that I really thought was interesting, I could share that lesson on like a 3 or 5 minute YouTube, so that someone who doesn't have the degrees in history that I do could give that same lesson, or if you as a parent have experience in a science or astronomy or biology or plants or whatever it is, you could do these little short clips to help everyone else who doesn't have that type of experience, right? Like, I would not know anything about how to like teach my children how to grow something, right? Because I have a black thumb and I plants do not like me. So like having that resource would be, that's where it came from. We kind of we just didn't move forward with it because of other things that were kind of crazed at the time. But I think it's still something that would be, we could organize that fairly easy for this fall semester and have that as a resource for people to do if it's something that, and I think that kind of connection with individuals would be super interesting.
Yeah, I like that.
I was in a meeting last night and a parent recommended that exact idea. I thought it was compelling. And so, yeah, no, I would fully support that. Though I think the parent's suggestion was to move, to have parents engage on a range of topics, not necessarily just what students are learning in the classroom, but that could be like small vignettes or videos that other parents or students could use just, to fill their learning time. Something else I was going to throw in, I do like this focus on parental involvement. I saw Gary, he came and spoke with us not long ago, but he was like one of the past teacher of the years for DCPS. And he too said like that is his, because I was like, what do you recommend that, we focus on? And he named parent involvement as well and how much of a game changer that is. Something I'm wondering, I know we have under our purview of roles and responsibilities to designate, what is it? How is it phrased? Sorry, I clicked away. Whatever it says, that for the state, we get to determine parent involvement. What does that mean? What does that look like? Is there some way we can engage on a more substantive level just beyond panels and videos with OSSI around what parent involvement should look like during this time?
Yeah, actually, John Paul, can you say again what you said before about what we have responsibility for, if that's the same, answering the same question? I forgot to ask you that.
The code specifically says that we are responsible for approving state level policies on parental involvement.
And have we done that recently? Like, when was the last time never? Okay. Interesting.
So maybe there's something to those panels that is getting at what should be our guidance or parameters for what parent engagement should be during COVID.
So that's a good point too. Just adding to that part of this is, our primary goal, I think, is to create something that's practical and useful, given the moment that seems pressing, right? But I think just, being able to then take this and think about how it might impact policy, or how we might impact policy using what we gather. Maybe this is our time, if we do start with parental engagement, to make recommendations around, what those policies should be. We need to go and look at what they are now, obviously, and see if what we're hearing, like if we're already there with what here in DC, or if there are things that we need to recommend based on what we find out from these webinars and from experts.
And I think potentially one of the resistances we're going to get here, right, is that engagement should be done at the school level, and so we shouldn't have state policies on engagement.
That's
but
interesting.
I think if we, but I think, and I get that, but I don't think they should be prescriptive of like, you must do 2 calls per week on this family and this that type of thing. But I think if we approach it in a best practices sharing type of way, of like, this is the community that we're serving, right? And there are people who are easy to contact, and there are people that are not easy to contact, and both need contact. So how do you do that? What's the right way of approaching the situation? How do you, what language do you use? How do you bring in this understanding that, if I'm calling someone, it's a different type of conversation than if Zach is calling someone. Like, these are things that you have to consider while you're making, entries into these communities.
That's right. I think that also, I mean, you're saying kind of what the teachers are saying in the conversation I had, which is that something they found that was better during distance learning in terms of engagement with parents is that they made a schedule, like schools would make a schedule of who was going to contact which parents when. And it wasn't necessarily the direct, like the assigned teacher. It depended on language. It depended on prior relationships. Like it might have been the teacher from last year who was contacting them. And it just was more like, it made it more feasible and logical to break things down according to actual knowledge of who was there, right? Like it's much more responsive. So I think we're in the infancy of actually using technology or this reality in a way that makes sense, as opposed to just replacing old practices, right? Like actually realizing or using it in a way that's beneficial. So I think we can learn more about that. Like, what does that look like, and share that in the form of recommendations. But it's also a way of sharing knowledge, and I think that's a really powerful thing to do at this time. Other thoughts? I mean, I guess my question then is, does that sound like a good plan? Is that something we can get behind and move toward? And if so, I do have some suggestions for like what our tasks would be going forward. Does it make sense to have maybe one panel on a topic? Maybe it would be parent engagement. I think we should wait to hear back from Darren and what he finds out from the surveys. And then, but mainly focus on having more outward facing webinars / town halls that are geared towards informing and, like sharing knowledge, basically. Not that we're sharing the knowledge, but we're setting up the forum for knowledge sharing. And then from that, we are able to then make recommendations. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
And I do just want to say, this is not giving up on well-rounded education and looking at or making sure that students are getting a rich curriculum and, building background knowledge and all of that. I think that's all super important. I just think we need to acknowledge that this school year is going to be an evolution. We're not starting at the same place. I'm stating the obvious, but that we're moving towards addressing that. Yeah. So I think Ruth, go on.
I was just going to one thing, which is that through the research committee, one of the things we'll talk about next time is what kind of surveying we want to do in the next year, because we have the resources for it. So at least my initial conception is that it would tap a number of different areas that the board is involved in. So we should just think about, if we had a survey of either teachers or parents, what are the kinds of things we'd want to know from them that would be useful for this? So
right.
Keep in mind.
Okay, so that it's sort of the whole or all teacher survey, but maybe it's all teacher and parent survey. Ruth, is that what you're talking about?
That's part of what we have to figure out. Which one do we do? Do we do both? How do we do it? How often do we do it, et cetera?
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on what Darren shares out about what's already been collected and what we would want to, what gaps need to be filled. Because if we don't want to, I mean, maybe we do. The thing is Darren, when you're mining those surveys, if it's possible to sort of also share out about how many, what was the sample size, and if there's information about who, like if there's, by ward or by, if there's any demographic information, so that we can also fill in those gaps as well. Like there may be information that's interesting, but there may not be the span that we want in terms of who and where it was conducted. But I think we want to hear, that's sort of step one, is getting that information and then figuring out what additional information we want to inform who we would invite, what we would do first, second, third, that kind of thing.
Can I suggest too that when Darren sends around the information, including that project plan sort of template from NASB, that we start looking at that as a sort of filling in the gaps between now and a year from now, whatever sort of our goal time is. I think that will also help us nail down what we're going to do, right?
Yes.
And what we need to do to get there, right? Because I think that's one of the things that this pandemic is changing a lot. There's so many things that we need to know we want to do, that we really need to figure out what our end goal is and have a project plan for it. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to have sort of these conversations about, well, this is important and this is important and this is important too.
Right. So you're saying we need to be more focused. Is that what you're saying, John Paul? And to stick to it? Yes, I agree. I think that's what I am hoping to land on, honestly, is that we know what we're doing by the end of this meeting, which we have 40 more minutes to do. And that then we can do that. We can fill in forms that make us stick to something, or just make it clear what we're doing and by when. So, who put stuff in here? Did I? Oh, Zach. This is the parent involvement. Great. Okay.
Yeah, it seemed like OSCE hasn't really issued any type of mandate or guidance for 10 years, which probably makes sense. And I thought the toolkit was helpful. But if we could just zoom out for a minute, I'm a linear processor and this conversation's been a little all over the place. So can we connect the dots? We're saying, or you could just tell me if I'm not comprehending this right, that we want to focus on how parents are engaged during this distance learning period, right?
I think that's where we want to start.
That's where we want to start, and that we still would execute on the survey, and the survey may be broad, obviously including that, but may touch on other things, right?
Yeah, I think the idea of the survey is to learn what is most pressing right now for stakeholders. So that would be parents and educators.
Got it. So it would include parents, but also others as well. So if that was a first step, then from that, that survey would inform the panels and discussions or whatever we push out.
Yeah.
But at first, it would be grounded in parent engagement or pushing towards parent engagement.
Well, I am suggesting that because of timing. I think if we want to start with the beginning of the school year, we do need to land on something to start with. And my sense is, from that discussion I had with the teachers, that's only one, but it makes sense to me. It's also come up in other discussions I've had just with parents, right? They are the front line now. Like I said, they are literal. So it just makes sense that even before we get results back, they're kind of happening simultaneously, I guess is what I'm thinking, that we're planning a first one that's focused on parent engagement. And then we're also figuring out what subsequent webinars / panels might be.
And then the third component that we were tossing around was issuing some guidance or recommendations, whether that's to OSSI or just in a mere resolution to say to LEAs, these are the things that we recommend based on what we learned.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
And
See,
I just wanna-
yeah, go on. Go on.
I just want to clarify one thing. When Zach just talked about the surveys, I just want to clarify this. This committee is doing sort of its own different kinds of grassroots surveys, in addition to which board-wide, there'll be some more formal surveys, right? We're doing both things.
Well, we haven't gotten to that. So, I mean, how we would do the surveys is something I think we need to decide on as well. So I had mentioned that in the meeting, the working meeting, that it would be more grassroots, but I think we should discuss what would be most effective. I don't know, I wasn't thinking that we had the ability to do a larger survey, but now that you reminded me that we do, I think maybe we need to think about what would be best.
Right, but that's fine, but it's also, I mean, that's more a one-time thing. So I just want to be clear that probably there should be two different ideas about this that interact.
Two different ideas about what?
Well, no, that the fact that there's going to be a overall survey is not that should not be our only vehicle for the surveying. So I'm agreeing that there should be the grassroots surveys because they can be more ongoing. And
right.
So I'm just saying they live side by side and they should.
They do
to some extent, but we should not imagine that the large survey takes the place of the rest. That's
right. And I guess also just taking advice from the teachers, again, that some of, like some of the surveys would be just calling families that we know, that it's about access. And that makes me think also about the webinars and access to those and who would tune in. And maybe we also need to think about format and how we would, make sure that whatever we're doing, it's accessible and inviting to folks who might not otherwise be able to or tend to tune into something like that. And then there's always language access that we have to think about. So I think those are details that once we start moving forward, we need to figure out. Other thoughts and concerns?
In terms of like the committee structure, is there any formal work that we need to do, John Paul or Ruth, there, or is it just we're changing our focus and we can keep moving forward? I mean, for those that are really tracking the work of the board, how do we get the word out that this is now going to be our focus?
Good question.
Yeah, I think once we settle on sort of a project plan or this is where we're heading type things, I think the first thing would be for you and Emily to email that out to the full board, just to say, hey, this is how our thinking has evolved on this topic. We want to bring you into the conversation, and this is what we plan to do. And then we through that process we'll make it public through our, September working session or through the posting of the meeting, right? Because these meetings are recorded, so we can post them.
Great, but we don't need to vote on anything.
I don't think so. As long as we inform the full board of what the new ideas are and plans are and the reasoning behind it. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a reason to fully vote again, because it seems to me like this is still in line with this education. Like the parental involvement can fall in that too.
Right. Yeah, and I think even before we move to sort of maybe change the name a little, like to focus on whole child, I think that the definition that we were building out really was starting to look like whole child. It was including social emotional learning, and it was including culturally relevant pedagogy, and it was, you know, and that was from the students that we surveyed. So I think I just think it makes sense to do what we need to do to be relevant. So that's what we're doing. No vote necessary. Okay. But so I think next steps then are that Zach and I are going to draft something to send to the members, the full members. And then Darren is going to share what he has mined from the surveys. I think that in the meantime, is it possible for engagement webinar? Is that, you know, something we should start doing plan it for September? Or do we want to start with a panel at our next meeting?
What do you think about actually starting with a call for board members to contact their schools in their wards and things, and find, you know, maybe one person from each ward that might be willing to come and talk about their experiences with it, whether it's a parent or a teacher or a principal, but you know, what are the things that are working and what are not?
Yeah. So wait, and do what with that? Just bring it back as information, or that's how we're starting? Like,
well, I think that's how we would figure out who we want on the webinar.
Got you. Right. So you're saying first step is figuring out who to get. And this is something that we had discussed, we being Zach and I think Darren and I, one way we might concretely use the equity framework as well as sort of a way of sort of vetting or figuring out, you know, what is most important. So that's another, I think it's a yes and, like we have a list of names and then we can maybe use the framework to think about who makes the most sense. But I think another way, yeah, you can reach out. It's also just knowing, like, again, the principal from Van Ness is not in my ward, but I think what they are doing with parent engagement is really powerful. So I would definitely put her on the list, you know. But yeah, I think that's also a good way, John Paul, of engaging the rest of the members is to ask that they do that.
Can I just say, if you want people on the board to reach out, I think you need to have a very explicit question about what you're looking for. I think just a general question about ideas about engaging, I just think that's either not going to get anything or it's going to get too broad. I think we need to be very clear about what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I would not keep it to, again, I think it's more thinking about what we're looking for and not so much like each of us should find somebody in our ward. I do think we need representation from east of the river for sure. But I don't think we need to like have one person from each ward necessarily. That's my thought on it. So I think it's more an ask, and it doesn't just have to be school leaders, right? It could be organizations that do this work to help schools improve their parent engagement, or it could be parent groups that are engaged in this. I mean, this is what Teaching for Change does. This is what obviously Kindred does, you know, so I think we can, this was the idea of the list that we started making. And so what we can start doing with that list, actually, maybe Darren and I can do this, is categorizing it, you know, so here are individuals and groups that would be really good for talking about parent engagement. Here are, you know, here's the list that would be good for well-rounded education. Here's the, you know, so kind of breaking it up by category. Does that make sense? Cricket.
Yeah, I'm thinking more on this, on the webinar thing, and I'm wondering, and this is going back to what you said at the very beginning about having, there may have been too many people involved in the group that you were talking with.
Yeah.
Maybe one of the things that we do is actually invite board members who are interested in doing this to host a webinar in their wards.
Focus group kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think if we can get one successful one first, so we have a model and see what it looks like, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we can do it. I mean, we already have the somewhat of the model of the sort of the lunchtime lives that we did a couple of.
Right.
We have that model, and it worked pretty well, and it got pretty good, responses, not only in the time in the day in the chat, but also afterwards once we put it on our social media and that kind of thing. So we have that model already, which is good.
Yeah. Okay. No, I like that. So maybe it's are you envisioning there would be like ward level lunchtime, what do you call them, lunchtime lives, and then one big webinar for the state board, or that we would just sometimes do the small things?
Well, I was envisioning, well, I mean, I think it depends on what we gather, right? Like what type of responses we're getting, and that type of thing. I mean, I think there are different levels of involvement. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. I think there's different levels of involvement in each school and each ward, right? So
Yeah.
with members of the state board. So I can see some members of the state board and doing almost like school-based level of engagement with the parents of a particular school, with the principal and teachers of that school. I also see some others that might want to do it on a ward-based type thing, so that there's more involvement from different people. And I think that's actually not a bad thing if we have a little bit of difference between the wards, based on the wards and what the individual members are comfortable with. So I'm a little hesitant to define exactly what I think we should do in everything. But my idea was to use that information to bring that up through our working sessions so that members could report out on, this is what I found. And hey, that's really interesting. I'm going to bring that up when I have my next conversation, which is in X,
Yeah.
And I think this also goes back to one of Ruth's points from well, frankly, probably from years ago, about how we as an agency do more sort of ward level outreach into our thing. Like how does the agency support a member in doing that community outreach, which is so important. And Ruth, I'm seeing your hand is still up. Is that from earlier, or is that new?
From earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is critical right now, is being more present at, the real hyper local level. And that the more we can do that, the better. And the more that we can be kind of in dialogue and showing that, there's a back and forth.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, one of the sort of stair steppers on this project plan that we'd be developing based on this conversation, I think, would be the development of a script or questions that we want the members to ask and focus on, right? So it's not a freewheeling type thing. And I think that's the piece too, that we also can bring it back a little bit to some of that, the well-rounded or whole child approach is adding in some of those questions too, about like, how does this school approach that,
Yeah. So I think what I can do, I mean, I can put this in the chat, but probably it's better if I just send it in an email as a document, is what next steps would be. And I think, we're starting to talk about that once we get information back from Darren, that we need to figure out what we want to ask. And that kind of leads to what you're saying, John Paul, which is, what do we want to ask? Like, we have to create those surveys, and they should be short and succinct and, something that can be used across boards. And possibly, it would be specific to some questions would be specific to content, but some of them might be general, just about what are your main concerns right now? What has gotten better? What has not gotten better? Those kinds of things I think we want to keep track of as well.
I agree. And I think, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
That's right. Go on.
I think one of the other things that we need to talk about too is what Ruth said earlier about having funding in the next fiscal year, which begins October 1st. So if we're thinking project plan, and we're now in August, so we have August and September to sort of plan out what we want to ask, how we want to ask it, what's the right format, what's the et cetera, so that on October 1st, we're ready to begin either solicitation of a person to do this type of research for us, or to do facilitation. If we don't need that, great, but we have that ability then on starting October 1st to put that in. And again, this is one of the things too that we had from previous surveying, right? Is because of our fiscal year begins October 1st, it's challenging to get someone in place until like November 1st, which means work doesn't necessarily always begin until the end of November or December. So I'm just in project planning mode of thinking through how all this is going to work through where we are now with having.
Yeah. So timeline wise, Darren, when I know you've started working on the mining, like when is that material going to be accessible to us?
It's in the note. I posted them this morning. Just a rough idea of what they were about. So it shouldn't be too much of a heavy lift to just go back in and pull the other information out. And whatever missing information or holes that I can't find, because a lot of the surveys have been closed, to just reach out to those organizations and just ask.
Great.
So I think Wednesday of next week.
Okay. And then I guess my concern is, I know once we leave this meeting, people kind of don't do much on this. And I'm wondering if it, just to be realistic, is this something that really is like Darren, Zach, and I do this work and we just come back to the committee and say, this is what we've done, this is what we're proposing, these are the next steps. Is that
Yes.
what makes sense? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, Marcus and Ruth. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's the answer. All right. So we're going to do that. So I think Zach and I are going to go over what Darren comes up with and sort of come up with questions that are, fill in the gaps we find, and then come back to the committee with that. We can also come up with a timeline, a more concrete timeline. But can I ask what would be realistic for a first webinar? And again, I asked this, I don't think we answered it. Is that the way to start, or should we start smaller? Honestly, I think doing the lunchtime in our own wards is a heavier lift because, it requires other people doing it. I think if it's us doing it, then we're just planning one thing and, we can kind of figure out what needs to be done for that. And I think then it kind of acts as a model.
Are you asking about time? Like, when should we do the webinar?
Yeah, because if we are planning, for instance, to do a webinar in September, we have to start planning that now. Reaching out to people, figuring out who would be on it, reaching out to them to see who's available, and making an invitation, right? Like, how many weeks out do you need to start that? I think 5, right? Just to get it all lined up.
My only caution now is just I don't think that's where parents' minds are or where our minds are, and so maybe pushing it back. If school starts at the end of August, let's say September, maybe we shoot for October, and that way parents have at least a month under their belt to have an opinion around like how things have changed from the spring.
Yep.
And we wouldn't be out competing, advertising an event while people are talking about technology and start of the school year. I just feel like now might not be the best time to be advertising something like that. But I could be wrong.
Yeah. I mean, everything is so fluid too. It's hard to know what to do when, like, what will feel relevant in a month could really change. And technology issues could change. You know, I mean, it's hard, but that's why I think this format appeals to me anyway, is that it's open enough. It's about kind of hearing what is real in the particular moment. I mean, we have a broad topic, but it's about asking the folks on the ground what is really happening for them and what is working and what's not, as opposed to us coming to them and saying, you know, delivering something, at least at this point.
Agreed.
Okay. So I think October makes me feel less stressed, and that's a good thing. I think that makes sense. Again, I don't know what makes sense I think it's hard to say.
And that also allows us to update the board, get the word out to the community about our focus before simultaneously trying to plan something.
Yeah. Okay. So, so I think, just wrapping up, that Zach and I will put together a proposal for that, for next steps, for both. I mean, I guess what we're putting together actually is both a proposal for questions that we would want to ask, and then also for what we would need from members of this committee and maybe members of the board, related to planning for that October webinar. Is there anything else we need to think about before we wrap up? Wow, I think this is the first meeting we're done like with time to spare. I'm not sure. I think. All right. Unless somebody else has something else they want to add or ask, I think we can go our separate ways for now. And
Thanks, Emily.
yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
You're the best,
Bye.
Emily.
Okay, we'll connect offline, scheduling that meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.
Bye, guys.
Oh.